In 1960, Soviet engineers looked at the fourth largest lake on Earth and decided to drain it. Not as punishment, as progress. The Aral Sea sat between Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, and it was enormous. 68,000 square kilometers, larger than Ireland, deeper than most people imagine, cold and clear near its center. Its shores supported a thriving fishing civilization. 60,000 people made their living pulling carp, pike perch, and bream from its waters. Steamships crossed it carrying cargo between Soviet ports. Children swam in it every summer. In Soviet maps, it was labeled simply the sea, because in that part of the world, there was no other. Then, in 1954, construction began on a canal. No one asked the fishermen. There was a decision made by engineers and approved by committees that water was more valuable somewhere else. And so it went somewhere else. The sea began to lose what it needed to survive. Not quickly, not violently. The way a fire dies when someone slowly removes the wood. Without drama, without announcement, until one day you realize the warmth is gone. The Soviet Union needed cotton. Not some cotton, all the cotton. The kind that would make the USSR self-sufficient in textiles, clothe the Red Army, fill hospitals with bandages, dress 300 million citizens. Central Asia had the climate. What it lacked was water. Water in the region came from two rivers, the Amu Darya flowing from the Pamir Mountains in the south, the Syr Darya running from the Tian Shan in the north. Both rivers fed the Aral Sea. Both were about to be redirected. In 1954, construction began on the Karakum Canal. 1,375 kilometers of engineered waterway cut through the Karakum Desert to carry water from the Amu Darya to cotton fields in Turkmenistan. It was the longest irrigation canal ever built on Earth. 500,000 workers dug it with shovels, explosives, and Soviet-era excavators. When the first sections opened, the newspapers called it a triumph of human will over nature. And, by the numbers, it was. Uzbekistan became the world's second-largest cotton producer. The fields turned white every autumn. Quotas were met. Officials received medals. But the sea had already started dying on the day the first shovel broke ground. What the engineers knew, and what appears in declassified Soviet planning documents, is that diverting those two rivers would eventually eliminate the Aral Sea's water supply. The sea had no natural outlet and no underground source. It lived entirely on what flowed in from the Amu Darya and the Syr Darya. Remove that input, and the math was straightforward. The official Soviet classification for this outcome was planned decrease. Not a side effect, not a problem, a feature. By 1960, water levels were already dropping, 3 centimeters per year, then 5, then 8. Fishermen in the port town of Muinak drove their trucks farther and farther out onto the exposed sea floor to reach the receding water line. Nobody in Moscow stopped the cotton program. The cotton program was working exactly as designed. The sea was losing a bathtub full of water every second. For 30 years, nobody drained it back. The fish started dying first. The water grew saltier as it shrank. Less volume concentrated the same dissolved minerals into an increasingly toxic brine. The 20 commercial species that had supported the regional fishing economy disappeared one by one. By 1983, commercial fishing in the Aral Sea was over. The canneries closed. 60,000 people lost their livelihoods within a single decade. By then, the sea had lost 4,000 square kilometers of surface, an area the size of Rhode Island, gone from the map. Then the sea did something the engineers had not fully modeled. It split. In 1987, the Aral Sea divided into two separate bodies, the small Aral in the north, the large Aral in the south. The island of Vozrozhdenia, which had sat surrounded by water in the sea's center, became a peninsula, then connected entirely to the mainland. That island had hosted a Soviet bioweapons testing facility, anthrax, plague, smallpox, brucellosis. Research conducted on the assumption that surrounding water would contain any contamination. Nobody warned the shepherds who started walking across the dry seafloor. When the water disappeared, nothing contained anything. The exposed seafloor became a new desert, the Aral Sea. But this was not clean sand. Decades of agricultural runoff, pesticides, DDT, herbicides, defoliants used on the cotton fields had settled into the lakebed sediment. That sediment was now exposed. It was dry, and it could blow. The salt and chemical storms began in the 1970s. Local people called them white blizzards. Walls of toxic dust carried by wind for thousands of kilometers, depositing salt and pesticide residue onto fields across Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, and reaching as far as Pakistan and the Arctic. The same land the irrigation project was meant to nourish was being poisoned by the project's consequences. 60 million people live in the Aral Sea basin. Not on its shores, in its basin. The area that depended on the rivers, the groundwater, the climate the sea helped regulate. Their weather changed, their water changed, their bodies changed. Throat cancer in the Karakum region rose to among the highest rates anywhere in the world. Infant mortality there tripled between 1960 and 1990, reaching numbers that exceeded wartime levels in some districts. Anemia, tuberculosis, and kidney disease became endemic, not because of poverty or sanitation failures, but because the water supply was chemically contaminated and the air carried toxic particulates with every wind. The Aral Sea had moderated the regional climate. Its massive surface area released moisture that softened winters and cooled summers across Central Asia. When that surface disappeared, the climate shifted. Winters dropped 4 degrees Celsius colder. Summers rose 4 degrees warmer. The growing season shortened. The cotton fields that drove the entire irrigation project began producing less cotton because the climate the sea had regulated no longer existed. The solution was destroying the conditions that made it work. All of that is invisible. The ships are not. In Muinak, the harbor became a graveyard. 12 rusted ships sit in the sand where water once was, 40 kilometers from the nearest shoreline. They never moved again after the water retreated. The town went from 40,000 residents to fewer than 10,000. The young left for the cities. The old stayed with the ships. A classified Soviet report from 1964, prepared by the Ministry of Land Reclamation, projected with accuracy that by 2000, the Aral Sea would lose 70% of its volume. The projection was correct. The report remained classified until after the Soviet Union collapsed. The cotton program was never paused. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. 5 new nations inherited the Aral Sea basin: Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan. Each needed the water. None had authority over the full system. The Amu Darya and the Sir Darya continued to be diverted. The sea continued to shrink. By 2007, the large Aral had lost 90% of its water. Satellite images from that year show what was once a seafloor indistinguishable in appearance from the surrounding desert. A crust of salt and contaminated sediment extending for hundreds of kilometers where water had been. 43 years after the classified report predicted exactly this, the world finally gave it a name: the worst man-made environmental disaster of the 20th century. Then Kazakhstan did something remarkable. In 2005, they completed the Kokoral Dam, an 8-kilometer earthen barrier built across the strait connecting the small and large Aral. The dam prevented water from draining southward. The small Aral began to refill. Within 3 years, water levels rose 3 meters. Fish returned, 14 species. Fishermen came back to Aralsk. By 2014, the port town had a shoreline again. The fishing boats had somewhere to go. The large Aral is gone. The dam saved the small Aral by sacrificing the rest. The water retained in the north is water that cannot reach the south. The large Aral is now the Karakum Desert, and no engineering project on the table proposes to reverse that. The sea that took millions of years to accumulate took 30 years to drain. This pattern is not history. In West Africa, Lake Chad has lost 90% of its surface area since 1963. Irrigation, population, climate, the same mechanism. In the Middle East, the Dead Sea drops 1 meter every year as the Jordan River is diverted upstream. In Europe, the Caspian Sea has fallen 2 meters since 1996 and is accelerating. And in 2022, the Great Salt Lake in Utah, on your continent, in your lifetime, hit its lowest recorded level in history. Same pattern, different coordinates. The engineers who designed the Karakum Canal were not monsters. They were solving a real problem: how to feed and clothe 300 million people, using the tools and the thinking available to them, inside a system that measured success in tons of cotton and not in liters of water. The engineers making similar calculations today are not monsters either. They are solving real problems, inside systems that measure different things. What the Aral Sea teaches is not that humanity is incapable of learning. It teaches that we are very good at learning too late, and that the people who make the decisions are almost never the people who pay the price. The sea was drained by people who would never watch it shrink. It was lost by communities who had no vote on what was taken from them. The question the Aral Sea leaves open is not whether another sea will be sacrificed for another plan. The question is whether the people living on its shores will know what is coming before the ships are already sitting in the sand. Which sea is it? And does anyone living on its shore know?